My parents forced me to hand over the house I spent years saving for and give it to my sister and her husband. They said, "They need it more. You can just manage by yourself." I refused. What happened next was rather unbelievable. I will tell you how everything unfolded. First, let me thank you for your continuous support. If you love stories like this one, support us by subscribing to this channel and comment where you are watching us from. It will be great to hear from you. Now let's jump into the details of what happened. I used to think building a house was the hard part. Pouring the foundation, hammering every nail, measuring the studs until my back ached and my fingers cracked from dry wood and concrete dust. But no, what no one tells you is the real labor starts long before construction. It's in every birthday party you miss because you picked up a second shift. Every friend you drift from because you're too tired to answer texts after a 12-hour day. Every meal you skip because eating out feels like a betrayal to the savings account. That's where the house was built, in quiet, invisible choices that nobody saw but me. My name's Marcus. I'm 33 years old, no wife, no kids. Grew up in a modest family just outside Sacramento, 2 parents who worked hard, a younger sister who was always tender, I guess. Natalie cried a lot as a kid. My mom always said it made her sensitive, and my dad said I should protect her. So I did. I took blame when the vase broke, gave up my room when she had night terrors, let her pick what we watched on TV, even if it meant sitting through reruns of Full House with gritted teeth. Back then, it felt like love. Now, I'm not so sure. By the time I closed on the house, I had poured nearly a decade of my life into saving. I worked IT full-time, security systems mostly, and drove Lyft most nights and weekends. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with no central air, shared laundry, and a crack in the ceiling that leaked whenever it rained. I ate ramen and canned soup for more meals than I'll ever admit out loud. But it paid off. I bought a small 3-bedroom in Roseville. Not flashy, but clean, with a yard big enough for a grill and maybe a dog one day. It was mine. No roommates, no landlords, no borrowing keys. Just mine. When I showed my parents the place, I expected a little pride. I didn't need confetti or a parade, just a smile or maybe a "well done, son." Instead, my dad walked through it in silence, tapping the walls like he was checking for termites. My mom ran her fingers across the windowsill and said, "It's a bit far from family, don't you think?" Natalie didn't even come inside. She stayed in the car, feeding her baby while her husband scrolled through his phone in the passenger seat. That was my housewarming. I should have known something was coming. About 3 weeks later, my mom called and said she and Dad wanted to drop by and talk. They showed up with a casserole, which was already suspicious because my mom hadn't cooked for me since I moved out at 20. We sat in the dining room, still echoing with bare walls and unpacked boxes, and I remember the way she folded her hands on the table like she was about to read a will. "Honey," she said, "Natalie and Jason are really struggling." I nodded. I already knew that. Jason had been laid off from his landscaping job, and Natalie hadn't worked since the baby came. They were in a 1-bedroom, both sleeping on a pull-out couch, while the crib took up the only real bedroom. "They've been looking everywhere," she continued. "But with a baby and no credit, it's just impossible." I waited. I already knew the pitch was coming. I just didn't know how bold it would be. We were thinking, maybe they could move in here. Temporarily. I looked at her, then at my dad. Then at the walls I had painted myself, the couch I had dragged in alone, the welcome mat that still had the price tag tucked underneath. "Move in here?" I asked. "With me?" "No, not with you," Dad said, clearing his throat. "You'd move back to your apartment. Or maybe stay with a friend. It'd just be for a few months. Until they get on their feet." I laughed. Out loud. It wasn't even bitter yet, just shock. The kind of laugh you let out when someone tells you the sky is purple and expects you to believe it. "Are you serious?" I asked. My mom looked wounded. "Marcus, they have a baby. And I have a mortgage," I snapped. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything. But something about the steel in my tone changed the air in the room. My dad's jaw twitched. My mom's eyes filled with tears she hadn't earned. "They're family," she said softly. "Don't you care about that?" I stood up and walked them to the door. I didn't slam it after them. I just locked it behind them and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. My heart was thudding so loud I could hear it in my ears. That night, I sat on my living room floor, surrounded by unopened boxes, and stared at the walls I had fought so hard for. And for the first time since I bought the place, it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a battlefield. For about a week after that night, things went quiet. No texts from my parents. No surprise visits. It felt like a storm had passed. One of those late summer downpours that shakes the windows but leaves everything standing. I convinced myself I'd made my position clear and that, maybe for once, they were going to respect it. That maybe, just maybe, I'd drawn a boundary they wouldn't cross. I was wrong. The second storm came packaged in fake warmth. My mother called a week later, her voice sugar-sweet and bright, like we hadn't just fought over my house like it was a shared sweater. "Sweetheart," she said, "we've been thinking, and we'd love to do a family dinner Sunday. Just us. No pressure." She even offered to cook my favorite, pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans with those little slivered almonds. I knew better, but I went. I don't know if it was guilt or hope. Some leftover part of me still wanted to believe that if I just showed up and played nice, things could go back to the version of family I used to pretend we had. That they'd admit they were out of line, or at least back down. Instead, Sunday dinner was an ambush. The food was on the table, but nobody was eating. Natalie and Jason were already there, their baby asleep in a car seat by the couch. Jason barely looked at me. Natalie gave me this thin, nervous smile, part guilty, part smug. My dad cleared his throat and got right to the point. "We spoke to a lawyer," he said, "and it turns out the cleanest way to handle this would be to put the deed in their name." I stared at him, then at my mother, who had the audacity to nod like this was some reasonable Tuesday afternoon suggestion. "You want me to give them the house?" I said slowly, trying to make sure I hadn't misheard. "Temporarily," my mom cut in. "Just until they're stable. Then we'll transfer it back." "There's no such thing as temporary when it comes to real estate," I said, my voice low, steady. "You're asking me to give away everything I worked for." Natalie finally spoke, her voice soft but tinged with practiced helplessness. "It's just, we don't have anywhere else to go, Marcus. You have a good job. You'll land on your feet." There it was, the sentence that burned hotter than the rest. "You'll land on your feet." As if that was the point. As if I hadn't clawed and bled for every inch of ground I was standing on. "No," I said. It was a simple word. One syllable. But in that room, it was an earthquake. My mom's mouth dropped open. "Excuse me." "No," I repeated. "The answer is no. You don't get to guilt me into giving up my house because you're used to me cleaning up everyone else's messes." "You're being selfish," my father snapped. "Your sister has a family, a child, and I have a life," I shot back. "One that I've built with no help from any of you." Natalie started to cry. Of course she did. Jason finally looked up and muttered, "You don't have to make this a whole thing, man. We're just trying to survive." "You don't survive by stealing from other people," I said. "And you sure as hell don't get to play victim while you do it." My mother stood up so fast her chair screeched against the floor. "If this is who you've become," she said, voice trembling, "then maybe we don't want you in this family." And just like that, I was disowned. The fallout was fast and vicious. By the time I got home, my phone was already lighting up with vague, performative social media posts. My mother posted a Bible verse about hardening hearts. My dad shared some meme about real family stepping up when it counts. Natalie's Facebook profile picture changed to her and the baby, captioned, "All that matters in the end." Cousins started unfollowing me. Aunts and uncles blocked me outright. One even DM'd me to say I'd turned my back on blood. As if blood ever paid my rent. I didn't reply. Not to any of them. Instead, I walked through the front door of my house, turned off my phone, and sat down on the floor of the living room. I looked around, at the bare walls, the boxes still half unpacked, the faint scent of new carpet. I thought about every hour of overtime. Every skipped dinner. Every lonely Friday night. I told myself it would all be worth it when I had something to show for it. And then I thought about the look in my parents' eyes when they decided I wasn't useful to them anymore. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept picturing the deed to the house, signed by me, paid for by me, and how close I'd come to just handing it away to people who would have swallowed it whole and left me nothing. But I hadn't. I said no. And even though the silence that followed was deafening, it was mine. The thing about being disowned is that nobody teaches you what to do the day after. There's no pamphlet, no checklist, just silence. An eerie, stretching kind of quiet that wraps around you like wet wool, heavy and hard to shake off. I woke up that next morning in my house, and for a minute, I forgot the fallout. I made coffee, stared out the kitchen window at my small, unkempt backyard, and for a brief, absurd moment, I wondered if my dad might come over to help me fix the fence. Then I remembered. He wasn't speaking to me anymore. None of them were. They hadn't called. They hadn't texted. Just posted and blocked and moved on. I kept going to work. I kept paying my bills. But something inside me was fractured in a way I didn't have the words for. Grief is a strange thing when the people you're grieving are still alive and breathing, just not choosing you anymore. Some nights I would sit in the living room in the dark, staring at the walls, wondering what they were doing. If they missed me. If they felt even a fraction of what I was carrying. They didn't. Not once. Darren, my coworker, noticed first. He's the kind of guy you wouldn't look twice at. Tall, soft-spoken, wears the same zip-up hoodie every week. We worked side by side for years without ever talking about anything deeper than malfunctioning routers. But that week, as we were loading equipment into the van for a job site, he handed me a Gatorade and said, "You look like you've been living underwater, man." I gave a tight smile. "Family stuff." "Oh." He nodded, like he'd been expecting that. "Cut off or cut out?" That stopped me cold. I glanced at him. "What's the difference?" He shrugged. "If they cut you off, it's punishment. If you cut them out, it's survival." I didn't say anything then, but the words stuck with me. That night, I stood in my empty guest bedroom, the one they wanted Natalie and her baby to live in, and thought about how many times I'd given pieces of myself away. Birthday gifts I couldn't afford. Last-minute Venmo transfers to help out. Emotional babysitting every time Natalie called me crying over bills, or Jason, or both. I've been taught to make myself smaller so others could breathe easier. But this was the first time I hadn't. And that silence? That vacuum of noise that replaced their constant demands? It started to feel like peace. Not comfort, not yet, but peace. The kind that comes with space. With not having to explain or justify or manage other people's chaos anymore. A week later, I started making changes to the house. Nothing dramatic, just things that made it feel more mine. I painted the guest room dark navy, replaced the light fixtures in the hallway, and finally ordered the couch I'd been eyeing online for months. I let the cardboard boxes in the garage sit a little longer. Progress didn't have to be fast. It just had to be real. On a quiet Saturday, Darren texted and asked if I wanted to grab a drink. I said yes, surprising even myself. We ended up at this hole-in-the-wall bar just outside of Roseville. Dim lights, sticky tables, cheap whiskey. The kind of place where people came to disappear for a while. We talked shop for a bit, then drifted into silence. Eventually, he asked, "So, what really happened?" I told him everything. The house, the demand, the dinner, the fallout. I didn't even mean to spill it all, but once I started, I couldn't stop. When I was done, he didn't say anything right away, just stared at the ice in his glass. Finally, he said, "I walked away from my family 10 years ago. Different reason. Mine were more violent than manipulative, but the feeling's the same." I nodded slowly. He looked at me, eyes tired but knowing. "You didn't abandon them, Marcus. They abandoned you the second you stopped being useful." That was the moment something cracked open in me. Not in a loud, shattering way. More like a hairline fracture letting light in. I drove home that night with the windows down, letting the cool air cut through the weight still sitting on my chest. I thought about the way Natalie cried on command. The way my mother weaponized guilt like a surgeon. The way my father looked at me like I'd betrayed some sacred trust, when all I did was protect what was mine. I thought about the word selfish, and how they threw it at me like a curse. But for the first time, I didn't feel ashamed of it. Maybe choosing myself was the most honest thing I'd ever done. The knock came on a Tuesday afternoon. Light, quick, almost polite. I almost didn't hear it over the low hum of the dishwasher and whatever jazz playlist was rolling through my speakers. I peeked out the front window, expecting a delivery or maybe a neighbor with a question about trash pickup. But it was her, Natalie. She stood there holding a half-empty baby bottle, wearing an oversized hoodie and jeans that looked slept in. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun that had clearly lost the battle hours ago. I froze for a second, staring at her like I was seeing a ghost. Then I unlocked the door and opened it halfway, keeping my hand firm on the knob. She gave me a small, tight smile. "Hey." I didn't answer. She looked past me into the house, at the clean hardwood floors, the navy walls, the furniture she once tried to inherit like it was hers by default. "It looks good in here," she said. "You've made it yours." "That was kind of the point," I said flatly. She nodded, her eyes flickering down to the porch. "Can I come in?" No, she didn't argue. Just stood there in that silence she used to fill with sobs or complaints or subtle digs. I noticed her shoulders slumped a little. Not defeated, just exposed. "Dad had a stroke," she finally said, like she was tossing it into the air to see if it would land. I blinked. My throat dried up, but I didn't react. "Is he alive?" "Yeah. He's out of the hospital. But they're drowning. Medical bills, meds, you name it. Jason hasn't found work yet, and Mom's barely holding it together." I waited. I didn't rush her. I wasn't going to do the emotional labor of pulling the ask out of her. Finally, she said it. "We need help." I let the words hang in the air between us. She didn't say, "Can you help?" She said, "We need." Like it was my job to connect the dots. Like she still expected me to cave. Old roles die hard, I guess. I leaned against the doorframe and exhaled slowly. "You all made it pretty clear I wasn't family anymore." "Marcus," she whispered. Her voice cracked just enough. "We were angry. You blindsided us. You tried to take my house," I said, sharper than I intended. "You didn't ask, you expected. And when I said no, you didn't just get mad. You erased me." She looked down again, this time not out of shame, but strategy. Her hand adjusted the bottle. "We thought you'd come around. You always do." That line, that truth. It stung more than anything else she could have said. "I know," I said quietly. "That's why you all did it. Because for 33 years, I've always come around. I let you take, and take, and take. But not this time." Her eyes were glassy now, but I wasn't moved. "You think you've got it hard?" she snapped suddenly, her voice trembling with fury. "You think being single and sitting in your nice house is some kind of martyrdom? Try having a kid and no options. Try being scared every time a bill shows up in the mail. You don't know what it's like." "You're right," I said. "I don't. Because I planned. I worked. I sacrificed. I built this from nothing while you were burning bridges I helped carry you across." She flinched. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Just stood there, humiliated and furious and refusing to admit either one. I softened. Just a little. "I'm sorry Dad's sick. I really am. But you came here to ask for something I already gave, a boundary. And if I bend now, it means every insult, every post, every threat meant nothing. I'm not doing that." She looked at me then, and I saw it. Beneath the resentment, the fear, the pride, she understood. I closed the door before she could say anything else. Not cruelly, just firmly. I sank down onto the floor behind it, my breath shaking, heart pounding like a war drum. Because here's the truth nobody talks about. Choosing peace doesn't always feel peaceful. Sometimes it feels like guilt, like grief, like a hole you dug yourself out of, only to find the air above is thinner and colder than you expected. I stayed on the floor a long time. Later that night, I played the voicemail Mom had left a few days earlier. Her voice was tight, controlled, but soft enough to be performative. "Your father's health is fragile. I hope you'll do the right thing." No apology, no regret, just a dare wrapped in guilt. I didn't respond. Weeks passed. The voicemail stayed on my phone, untouched, unacknowledged. Some nights I hovered over the delete button, thumb hovering like hesitation itself. But I never pressed it. I didn't play it again, either. Just kept it there, like a scar I wasn't quite ready to cover. I thought the worst of the fallout was over, but pain doesn't expire. It lingers. It echoes. The silence from my parents became a strange kind of noise. Not actual sound, but a feeling. Like a vacuum pulling at me from across town. I'd catch myself checking social media, even though they'd blocked me. I drive past the old neighborhood just to see the lights on in their windows. I wasn't ready to go in, but I wasn't ready to forget either. One night, out of nowhere, I got a text from my cousin Jamal. We weren't close growing up. He lived 2 towns over, but we always got along at family gatherings. His message was short. Just so you know, not everyone bought their version of it. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. After a few moments, I wrote back, "Whose version?" "Your mom and Natalie." A lot of whispering, but some of us remember how hard you worked. What they did was foul, man. You were right to walk. It was the first validation I'd received in months, and it cracked something open in me, not in a weepy, dramatic way, but in a quiet, startling relief I hadn't realized I was desperate for. We texted back and forth for a while. Jamal told me he hadn't spoken up earlier because he didn't want to get in the middle, but seeing how bad things had gotten made him rethink. He wasn't alone. A few others, mostly cousins, were asking questions now. About the house. About the disowning. About me. Apparently, Aunt Lacey had been stirring the pot in her own way. She'd called my mom out at a recent family lunch, saying, "Funny how Marcus was family when he was loaning money, but not when he said no." That woman had always been a bit of an outcast herself. Rumor was she'd given up her half of Grandma's inheritance so my dad could start his auto shop 20 years ago. He never paid her back. She stopped coming to holidays after that. I never knew the full story, just vague mutterings from my mom about Lacey holding grudges. I called her. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but she picked up on the second ring like she'd been waiting. "Marcus," she said, like we were old friends. We talked for nearly 2 hours. I told her everything, and she listened like she already knew how it would go. When I got to the part about the dinner, the deed, the disowning, she let out a low whistle. "Sounds familiar," she said. "They eat their own, honey, as soon as you're no longer feeding them." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so damn accurate. She told me about her own fallout, how she gave up her share of the inheritance thinking it would bring the family closer, only to be painted as bitter when she later asked for support. "I learned the hard way," she said, "that some families don't love you. They just love what you can give." We met for coffee that weekend. She was older than I remembered, smaller too, but her eyes were sharp and warm. She brought a photo album, one I hadn't seen in years. There were pictures of me as a kid, building pillow forts with Natalie, helping Dad wash the car, eating popsicles with Aunt Lacey on the porch. "They didn't always treat you like this," she said, pointing to a picture of me holding Natalie's hand at a school play. "But somewhere along the way, they decided your role was to carry everyone else." That stuck with me. On the drive home, I passed my parents' house again. This time, I didn't stop. I didn't linger. But I did something unexpected. I pulled into a nearby pharmacy and bought a gift card for groceries. $100. I didn't sign it. Didn't leave a note. Just drove by their house in the early morning hours the next day and dropped it in the mailbox. It wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't about guilt. It was about me. About proving to myself that I could be kind without being used. That I could feel compassion without reopening the door to manipulation. That I could still be me, a man with a heart, without letting that heart become an open wound. I didn't hear anything back, and I didn't expect to. But that night, for the first time in a long time, I slept without grinding my teeth. Chapter 6. Mine, still the first real laughter in my house, came exactly 1 year to the day after I signed the mortgage. It wasn't a celebration. I didn't plan it that way. It just kind of happened. A few friends from work, Jamal and his wife, and even Aunt Lacey, who brought brownies and her old Polaroid camera. We played cards, ordered pizza, and talked about everything but family. At one point, Darren leaned back in my kitchen chair, tapped the wall with his beer, and said, "This place feels lived in now." I smiled. It did. Not in a messy, cluttered way, but in a way that whispered comfort. The paint had faded in a few spots where the sun hit hardest. The fridge was littered with takeout menus and magnetic poetry. There were nicks in the hardwood from when I dropped the coffee table during a solo rearranging spree. These weren't imperfections. They were proof. Proof that I had stayed. That I had chosen to keep living in a space where I was once tempted to give up. Later that night, after everyone left and the house was quiet again, I stood in the hallway, barefoot on cool wood, staring at the bedroom door that used to make my stomach twist. The guest room, the one that was supposed to go to Natalie. Now it held a bookshelf, a soft reading chair, and a secondhand keyboard I'd been teaching myself to play. Sometimes I lit a candle in there and read until midnight. It had become my favorite room, not because it was fancy, but because it was the most mine. I hadn't spoken to my parents since the voicemail. I didn't need to. Aunt Lacey told me that Dad was doing better, back on his feet, though moving slower. Natalie and Jason were still scraping by, bouncing between rentals and leaning on anyone who would let them. I wasn't angry anymore, not in that sharp, acidic way that keeps you up at night. But I wasn't offering more, either. I'd done my part. I'd drawn the line. And for once, I hadn't crossed it to make someone else comfortable. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a drink. Not to celebrate, exactly, but to mark the moment. A quiet kind of toast. To survival. To boundaries. To the version of myself that stopped bleeding for people who never offered a band-aid. I raised the glass to the window, to my reflection, and whispered, "We made it." Not just through the silence, or the guilt, or the loneliness, but through the part where I could have gone back, could have knocked on their door and said, "Fine, take it, I'll start over." That would have been easier in some ways. Familiar, comfortable. But I chose the hard thing. I chose myself. The world didn't applaud. No one threw me a parade. But that night, my house was warm, and quiet, and safe, and that was enough. If you've ever stood your ground and lost people you thought would love you forever, know this, you didn't lose. You reclaimed. Let me know in the comments, what's your line in the sand? And was it worth drawing, even if you stood alone? If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss another story about family, boundaries, and the price of self-respect. See you soon in the next story.